It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest. Welcome everybody to another Archaeodeath interview with my special guest, and today's special guest is Dr. Klaudia Karpińska. A brand new doctorate, a brand new thesis has entered the world of academia thanks to Klaudia's hard work. So welcome, Klaudia, and would you be willing to give us an introduction to who you are and what your thesis was all about?
Thank you so much. I am really welcome everyone at this channel. And I am Klaudia Karpińska, and I was in general, because I defended my thesis, PhD student and newly defended Doctor of Archaeology at the University of Oslo. And I'm still occupied with the meaning of birds in the Viking Age funerary rituals. And I'm also exploring meaning of those fascinating animals in a little bit in iconography and later medieval written sources. So it's a very broad and very interesting topic to be occupied with.
I mean, it certainly is, and it's an exciting one that I think a lot of people will go, oh, Vikings, Norse mythology, ravens, but you know, we're going to go on a journey that takes us in many directions and many different avenues, different types of birds and their connections with life and death. But I wanted to start off by asking you about how you got into archaeology and started out. How did you become this? How did Klaudia Karpińska become Dr. Klaudia Karpińska? How did it all happen?
So to be honest, it was kind of a long journey, because I started my fascination with the Viking Age with exploring basics of funerary rituals. So I was previously very occupied in the Viking Age cremation, and from my childhood, I was interested in the meaning of various animals and their what they do, how they live, and so on. So I was, during my school time, occupied with biology, and I was really into different animals. So that come back to me when I started to go into archaeology. I just before started my master thesis at the University of Rzeszów, I thought about choosing a main topic, and I started analyze and going into some different Viking Age topics, but turns out that at this time it was impossible to do it in Poland because of the lack of the access to publication, to sources like bones, like museum collection, and so on. So I just chosen another topic for my MA thesis for people who are interested in. So it was meaning of weaponry in water context from Poland, as well as from some areas in Denmark. So it was like a comparative study. I come back to this topic after defending my MA thesis. I decided to prepare some application for a short-term DAD project. What is DAD? It's a Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst. It's an organization that provides students at the different level of educations with various scholarship, grants, and so on. So I proposed this topic, so meaning of birds in the Viking Age, and then I started to look more into. I started this in Kiel, and looked into very old journals, and I also traveled to analyze bones in collection in Sweden as well as Denmark, and later Norway. So it evolved so year by year. So I started to be more precise in 2014 with some basic ideas, and that developed over the years. So it was in some years it was very intensive, like during this DAD project, and later it was a little bit less intensive, like short visits in the museum, and I just started with creating the catalog of graves, and I'm basing on this, I started to look into meaning of these birds, into iconography, and so on. So yeah, it was really, really long journey. So to be honest, it consists of many steps. And after ending this DAD project, I had to start studies, so PhD in Rzeszów, because I need some affiliations. And I also proposed this topic, like meaning of birds, but it was again so impossible to end because of the law regulation and problem with supervision and so on. So I started to applying at different universities for PhD project, and I was lucky enough to get a scholarship at the University of Oslo, and then I started my PhD. And I also by the very beginning, I used some things which I gathered during my previous projects. But the main core I developed. Core of my thesis I developed over the years of my PhD at the University of Oslo.
So that's really interesting. So when you say, just to clarify, then you'd already done a project, started a catalogue of graves with birds in them from the Viking Age, and that sort of were you built upon? Did you, in your thesis, did you look at a broader geography, or was it more, did you expand it in other ways? How did the previous work relate to your doctoral research?
So it was really broad at the very beginning, because I started with the catalog of all graves in Scandinavia plus British Isles, and it was really, really broad. So I started digging, looking into reports, into articles, and it was getting broader and broader and broader. And when I started PhD, first months I spent some on the conversation with my supervisors, what to do with this huge amount of knowledge and how to make it a little bit focus on the geography, on the graves from the particular geographical area. So
right.
Yeah, so I chosen to be chosen only graves from two parts of Sweden. So mainly Öland, so that's one of the biggest isle in Sweden, as well as Uppland. It's a central Sweden, so area of Stockholm, Uppsala. And I also choose some graves from Norway, and that's in general the whole Norway, but there are very few of them. And there is also some limited access to some reports because some graves were excavated in 19th and very early 20th centuries, so they are not properly documented. So plus preservation in Norway is very difficult, so therefore there are few graves from Norway. And I also have some short mention about egg remains from Gotland in Sweden. So it's like some additional thing, because my thesis and my work was focused directly on bones. But I also took into account eggs as some kind of the curiosity.
Thank you for clarifying that. So tell us, what did you find out about birds in the Viking Age? What was the key things that came out of your thesis to your mind? I know you can't, don't want you to read out the entire thesis, but what do you think are the key highlights that the broader audiences would be interested in?
So in general, people, when they think about Viking Age and birds, so they think ravens, maybe some birds of prey like hawks, falcons, and so on. But it turns out so that most common birds in the Viking Age graves are some domestic chickens, so, or
yes,
or what waterfowl, like for instance, wild or maybe domesticated geese, and that's the main thing which comes out in the bone identification and what is more popular. And also turns out that those birds could have kind of varied meanings in the funerary rituals that were not only associated with prestige or gifts, but they also some could be related to some different perception of the other world, so they could also some manifest several ideas at one time. They also some could be some kind of the not in the so direct sense, but in the metaphorical sense, some occupants of the mounds after death of some guardians. So yeah. So and they also some could be some belongings of buried people, and they could also some be some birds that were some brought from very far away, like for instance peacocks from Gokstad grave, and that's also some interesting topic to explore.
Yes, of course.
But my thesis in general some show that there were some various interactions between human and birds, and I also some stressed in my thesis that they were some they could happen some not intentional interaction between human and birds. So they could also some appear accidentally at the burial place, and they could also some interact with people, like try to take some freshly killed mammals that were offered during the ceremonies. I think so in the analyzing this some human-animal interactions, human-bird interactions in the Viking Age, it's very important to look on the different aspects of those interactions and what could possibly happen, not only some inside the grave, but also around the grave and at the burial site, and also some what could happen so later, because some birds could be also some placed in the later phases of the funerals, or even at some years ago. So
that's really helpful. Can I just maybe to step back for some of our other audiences, perhaps the popular perception of a Viking funeral, is one that's heavily theatrical, and there's animal sacrifice, including dogs, horses, and birds, chickens too. Maybe there's human sacrifice. These are really sort of elaborate performances involving killing and deliberately destroying by either burial or burning of these economic resources. So why can't we, just as a devil's advocate, why can't we just see this as showing off? Why can't we just see this as this is part of the wealth of the farm, or these are gifts that kin would bring to show honor to the dead person, not necessarily the animals of the dead person? Why can't we see it as economic? Is why? Because you're talking about these other associations of symbolism, which I think are really fascinating. But do you have an easy sort of pushback against people that might say, "Oh, isn't this just that their funerals are really, extravagant, really elaborate"? Is that's perhaps misleading, I know, but how would you counter that take?
So in general, so birds also appear in the very elaborate graves. So but in the case of some ecological, economical aspects and involving birds, so they, as I mentioned, they could be some symbols, but they could be some have had function, specific function. So they, not all birds so were treated so equally. So some of them by some people could be treated only as some kind of the goods, belongings, farm animals, and some could treated that birds especially. So for me, during creating of the thesis, was important to also to state that some birds could, human attitude to birds could vary from region to region and from even grave burial ceremony to burial ceremony. So it's a little bit complex to say that, yeah, they were some very rich graves and they were, and in general, so birds, because we have several those rich graves, so birds mean that and those, and they were associated with those and that ideas. So I think some they could be some general ideas, but I am also stressing that they could vary from place to place. So
exactly, we're not trying. Yes. There's not a single Norse mythology. Ravens mean X and Y, and therefore when we find them in the burial they must mean this, they're about Odin, or chickens are this and therefore they relate to the tree Yggdrasil, and or the end, there's not you're not trying to sort of map Norse mythology directly onto this complex data. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, so to be honest, so we have very few mention of birds in general in this written sources, and it's some of them could be associated with those, so could have so graves in birds in graves could have some similar meanings as those mentioned in the written sources, but in particular in the description of funerals, I mean, so Ibn Fadlan, for instance. So, but in general, so those mythological birds are kind of problematic to associate it with those birds in the graves. So yes. I just would like to clarify that we unfortunately don't have any raven bones in graves or raven eggs. So it will be disappointing, but I am hearing or reading some comments of different people, and there were appearing in some discussion, conversation that, oh, they were some eggs, raven eggs in some graves, or there were some raven bones. And that's kind of, I don't know, from those ideas of raven bones came out, but this about raven eggs, so that was because of some problem of interpretation of the egg found in the Skopintul urn that was discovered in the museal collection many years after some excavation of the grave, and it was interpreted by the basing of the structure of the shell as raven because it was so similar to common raven eggs. But when they did some DNA analysis, it turns out that it was purely chicken egg. So unfortunately there were no ravens,
I heard that too,
raven eggs in a grave. So I'm really sorry. So some people probably will be disappointed.
But this is why it's so important when you see newspaper headlines or discussions online or just conversations at conferences to not believe everything until it's finally out. I think that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. And so, okay, can we then talk about maybe if the chickens and maybe geese are the principal birds, what are the potential symbolism of these birds? I love the idea you mentioned about protecting the grave. I'd love to hear more about that idea.
So it's kind of interesting idea. So because we have a few, if I remember well, there are about 7 graves with unburned chicken bones. So they are cremation graves from central Sweden, Uppland and Öland. They were kind of interesting because all of the bones like belonging to human and other animals, so mammals and also other birds, were completely burned, and only one chicken, so was not burned, and in different graves they were placed inside urn, by urn, or in the central part of the cremation layer. And those chickens, so that's one of the possibility. That could be treated as some kind of the guardians, or maybe some kind of the messengers between worlds, that traveling some back and forth, so between spheres of living and dead. So there are so strange things happen, because people decide to choose this bird, not like prominent some birds like birds of prey, but simple chicken. And some general people who observe chickens, so can see that the chicken make a crows, so it's associated with some dusk and dawn, and it's some animal in between, so in particular roosters, so it could be something happening in the minds and associated those birds particularly with some kind of the transgression or liminality. So therefore I presented in my thesis this as one of the possible interpretation, like birds being some kind of the guardians or messengers in the grave that live there and fulfill this function.
I like that idea.
Yeah, it's kind of something new, because it was not previously presented in the relation of those graves, and I think those graves are kind of very interesting to be analyzed. I think they require some graves that are still in the archives in Sweden, so require some maybe further analysis and checking that they are maybe some unburned bird bones, because during my studies I also discovered that some bones are in some cremation graves unburned, and they were described as burned because they were covered with some ash, some like they were so dirty, so to be honest. So yeah, so that happened. So maybe they were more graves of this type, but for now they are about 7, as I mentioned. So
what about the geese then? How do they fit in?
Geese are kind of interesting. So because it's in general, just to explain for general public, so it's very difficult to say that basing only on the bones. And fragmentary bones in particular, that those geese are domesticated or were wild. So they are very close in the matter of the bone, so size and bone look. So I think so when we have some domestic geese, so could have some kind of a little bit different symbolism that wild geese. So because some domestic could be some associated more with like a farm, like a life, and some maybe wealth, because domestic geese are still not so common in the Scandinavia. And wild could be associated more with the wilderness, with some travel, because they are some migrating birds, and they are disappearing and appearing in spring or in summer in some regions. So, and they could also could be treated as some parts of the dishes, because I have some fragments of young geese from one grave in Denmark. I mean Stengade free grave from Stengade 1 cemetery. So it's kind of interesting chamber grave with only leg remains, remains of the leg of 3 young, probably young geese. So and they could also be treated as some animals whose parts were used as some kind of the maybe some kind of the protection tools, because in the grave in Snubbe Korsgo there was discovered only one completely preserved bones of the left wing of goose.
Ah,
That was placed directly by the left some arm and elbow of a man. So
oh,
it's kind of interesting case because it's a one and only grave of this type with remains of the wholly preserved goose wing. And it's this wing could be used as a part of the some funeral rituals as a prop, maybe used to spread some smoke, fragrance, and so on.
oh,
And it
yes.
could be also used as some part of the um, healing tool. So because it could happen that this man had a damaged arm and cannot use it properly, had some sickness, and maybe this wing was placed in the grave as a some counterpart of this man's arm, and maybe it was intended by mourners to somehow heal this man in the other world. So to provide him with a properly working some extremity. So it's one of the possibility. And geese could be wild geese, as I said, could be associated with the wilderness, with some also with maybe hunting. So it depends, of course, on the grave and on the region, and of course on the also the presence of other birds, because geese also some tend to appear with the remains of the other wild or maybe also some birds that could be used in hunting like falconry birds, but this is kind of problematic topic and also some kind of difficult to explore because we don't have any falconry tools in Viking Age graves. Yeah.
Ah, I thought there'd be more evidence of that.
Yeah, unfortunately, so we have some bells, some tools that could be used as a part of the stripes, but they were not placed on the bird bones or with the graves with the bird bones. So for instance, we have bell with one grave from Norway, but we don't have any bird bones there. Those bells could be also used as a part of the costume. They could also be used as a part of the dog leash, as a part of the dog collar, some part of the horse equipment or rider equipment. So there are multiple possibilities. And there is also some no evidence from bird bones like falconry birds, I mean falcons or hawks, that they were used breed for falconry. There's also some this matter is kind of problematic, so because of the lack of the so certain evidence. So we could suppose that some birds may be used, but the other matter is that so prepare falconry birds was very expensive at this time in the Viking Age, and it's also some question that the people are really willing to devote this bird during the funeral, even they had lots of money and lots of resources. So yeah, it's also some question to be put in this discussion.
Are there any other? So you've talked about geese and hens, and chickens, sorry, and you've got the birds of prey. What about? I mean, there are other bird species. Do we find at all?
So we had also some wild birds, like some several species of wild ducks, for instance, possible mallard. But
Oh,
when I mention so those species like so wild ducks, so they are kind of problematic to analyze because some ducks bones are similar, and there are also some margin that they could belong to different species. So
yes. There's lots of.
they were also some remains of possible roof from one grave, but they made also some belong to other birds. So because they usually those bones are some fragmentary, or even they are preserved in whole, so they belong to the one extremity, for instance, to legs, leg, or only to legs, or only to part of wing. And some birds have similar bone in size or in shape. So, and they were also some birds like wild gurus, like capercaillie. So they also some happen to be in graves in Sweden, from tuna, for instance. But I am very cautious in the some putting very some strict interpretation of them, because I'm taking into account that some bones could be not properly interpreted, and what the problem is that some of those bones, like for instance from tuna grave or from many other Swedish graves or Norwegian, were lost during Second World War, or they were lost during the moving on the collection from one place to another.
Right.
Or they were just maybe throw it away after excavation because they were not necessary. In the opinion, of course, of the people who excavated grave in the 19th or early 20th century. So, yeah, so that's one of the possibilities. So, yeah, those so there are not so many different species in the graves, but they are, of course, some wild birds. So, in majority, they were domesticated like chickens. So, yeah, so they are not, and there's those peacocks in the Gokstad grave are unique, and they are only two in one grave for the whole Viking Age.
So that, yeah, I mean, that's what captures the attention, the Gokstad bow, but it's good to have that confirmed. They are exceptional. They are not typical, that there may have been these exotic birds, but they weren't everywhere bouncing around emporia and farms and,
Yeah, so I wonder in my thesis that those birds were, because it's also important that they were maybe belong to this man during his lifetime, and they were kept as some curiosities at farm.
Yeah.
Or maybe they were just brought especially to funeral. That's there are two different possibilities, and there are also some give other possibilities to interpret the whole grave and the whole ceremony, because birds as a part of the farm could be treated a little bit differently, and birds brought especially at the funerals gifts from far away, maybe from Near East, or maybe from Central Europe, because they were confirmed that at some parts in the present Germany, they were kept some peacocks as a part of the very elaborate courts, and they were treated as curiosities, as some ornaments and special pets. So yeah, so it's there are two possibilities for those birds, and they also give some another two possibilities to be interpreted. So.
Are there any other interesting things about the grave finds before we move on and discuss the art and the literature? Is there anything else you think we listeners would like, or viewers would like to learn about the birds in the graves?
There are also some interesting things that, for instance, in the case of those boat graves, like tuna, Goksta.
Yes.
So those birds, there are different species, but they were placed as only animals on the boat. So other animals, they were placed so by the side of the boat, behind the boat, or sheep. There are some two possibilities that there were no place for those animals in the ship, but it's kind of problematic to say in the case of Gokstad. It's a huge ship, so you can place even two horses on it, or all dogs. So there is something happening, that birds were chosen to be placed as only animals close to that. So for instance, in Goksta, so we have those peacocks placed together with two hawks close to this grave chamber. In Tuna, so they are placed some birds because Tuna is problematic. Tuna graves were problematic, so they were damaged, not properly documented but based on those drawings, which are some relatively detailed, so it's possible to say that those birds were placed also some in some bow parts or row parts of a boat. So, but the Tuna graves are kind of a little bit problematic in the case of documentation. So, but there's also some grave from Orbi, and it happened that one chicken is also placed on a boat. So that could be some association of the birds with traveling, moving, crossing border, or being some psychopomps maybe. So in the eyes of the mourners, in the eyes of the people who created those graves. So I think this could be some also fascinating for the audience, just to hear that birds tend to be chosen as a part of a ceremony and place it in the prominent places in the grave.
So no ravens, but any other corvids, magpies, jackdaws, rooks, crows?
It happens that they were some single bones, like leg bones, that belongs to crow, but they were placed in some uncertain context. So that could be brought with a soil, that could be just placed accidentally, so they could be maybe killed during the ceremony and just split it maybe by the dogs or maybe by the wild animals, because we also could take into account that some burial ceremonies could last some days, weeks, and even months.
Exactly.
So that could happen that they were some placed there accidentally, and there's only one example in which this bone of corvid is placed intentionally. So it's this Ripton grave, if I remember well.
Oh, the Repton, yes.
But it's kind of more associated like an amulet and placed in a pouch. So it's kind of different situation. It's not like placing some bird and willing bird to fulfill its function, but it's kind of placing part of the bird as some maybe amulet, or use it as some kind of the part of the spell and so on. So
but it's also important to know that isn't typical, because popular audiences tend to hear about that grave and think, oh, and this is how people died like a Viking. And, it's important that we know that from the whole of Scandinavia so far, we don't have a parallel to that. That's really interesting. Thank you. I was going to ask before, do you feel that if birds were the only animals put in the center of these boat graves, these elaborate boat graves, do you think archaeologists have missed, given the small size and fragility of bird bones? Do you think past generations of archaeologists have simply missed many of the birds sacrificed and placed in graves?
I think it's possible that they missed, but some of them are devoted to some details. For instance, those so Jarma Stolpe mentions some birds' remains in some Birka graves, even though those bones are not preserved into collection. So it happens that they document those bird bones, but I suppose that when they very evident, sometimes they could happen in the small numbers, so they were so maybe very damaged, fragmented, like burned bones, and they were omitted or maybe treated as some rodent bones because of the lack of knowledge, or just throw it away with the soil, so they could also be placed in the other layers of a grave. So there are multiple possibilities. So I'm not excluding that all the graves that's in some graves could be bird bones, but because of the bad documentation, so they were not mentioned in the report, or they were just thrown away. So Yeah, so it's kind of possible. So, but for me, it's a little bit far-reaching, just to say that in some graves were definitely bird bones, even though they were not documented, not mentioned.
Yeah.
So, so when they, so I think in some graves they could be placed, could not be documented, but it's a matter of some discussion and checking. So also some reports. So particular those graves so recently excavated. So.
Thank you. I was going to ask about what the art and literature tells us that might shed light on these finds. Maybe you want to anything about the art that we know. I mean, obviously birds are represented in Viking art, but what kinds and how?
So it's interesting question. So we have different bird representations. So in general, so birds were so depicted as a part of the hybrid animals. They were also some very entangled into different ornaments. And now I know that there is a lot of going on. So and a lot of good research done with the person so who used a pseudonym so Children of Ash. So he Luciano, if I remember well, so he did a lot of good research on the meaning of art in the Viking Age. I know that he discovered lots of interesting birds, but I am leaving him to speak about it. So, but from my perspective, I discovered that there were some depictions of birds that could be swans. It's interesting because we don't have, again, no swan bones in the funerary context, but we have some swans as depicted in some small figurines, this Hedeby throne, or we have on the Gotlandic picture stone. So they happen in some visualization, and we have some possible ravens, but it's also some difficult to say that those birds are definitely ravens, or maybe they were some badly depicted crows, or maybe other birds. So or maybe they were just some hybrid of raven, bird of prey. So and we have also some birds, as I mentioned, birds of prey that could be hybrid of different species. And what is interesting in those Viking Age art, I mean between 9th and 10th century, we don't have any depictions of chicken. So chickens, roosters appear in the early Christian art. So they appear on the runic stone from Sweden, so as a part of a depiction of a cross, so they sit on the cross, or they were depicted as a part of those small brooches. But from the Viking Age, we don't have some clear depictions of domestic chickens or peacocks. So also peacocks appear in the 11th century as a part of the early Christian art. So and when they appear at this time in Scandinavia, so there were some influences from the British Isles. So and so to say more about art, so birds are very depicted in a very schematic way.
Yes.
For instance, there is depiction of a duck from Birka that is a very simple, so probably toy made of bone, and it looks like a little bit like an eider duck, but I'm very cautious in this interpretation.
Sure.
So and it's also some depiction of a duck from a small amber, that it's kind of some drawing made of person who maybe got buried in the past and maybe try to make some pendant and not succeeded and just throw it away, some amber. So and those more interesting, so that they are from, as I mentioned, so from Hedeby throne, when we have those possible swans sitting on the one side and another. And there are also some possible depictions of the of water birds on other throne from one of the Iceland in Denmark. I don't remember the name of the place of discovery now, but it's one of the three so-called silver thrones, and we have those depictions. Very schematized one on this layer, so-called Odin frame.
Yes,
yeah. So birds happen in art, but as I mentioned, so there's a lot of to decode. In my opinion, so Luciano did and doing lots of good job. He is a specialist so in decoding art. So I just analyze so those very obvious examples that could be compared with archaeological material, because that was one of the aims of my thesis, just to do comparative analysis. So I not went into so many details, because birds also appeared in some entangled ornaments, like when you look on the Oseberg, when you look on this decoration on, for instance, some turtle brooches. So they appear as a part of the decoration, but they could not be birds per se, but they could be also some hybrids or part of the some beasts.
They needn't be mapped onto real world species, because they may be mythological or supernatural things hybrided. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what about, so there's no real easy match of the visual data or the artistic data onto the archaeology. What about the written sources? What can we say from those about the death rituals or the society more generally in their attitude to birds?
It's probably audience firstly think about some sagas and eddas when we start talking about birds. So we have mention of birds in Eddic poems as well as in sagas, but they are not so often mentioned. So they just to mention, so they could be mentioned as kennings, so metaphors. And I not analyze in my thesis those kennings and their meanings, because that's kind of require a lot of going into language and meaning of particular words that change it also with the course of time. So I analyze clear description when the possible author of a written source mean bird per se. So they were so known to public. Mention of ravens, so Hunin, Munin, and as well as they were mention of giants and Odin, who transformed into eagle. We have also some Harbrock, if I remember well. So mentioned as one of the best of his species, hawks. And we have this some ropes, swan ropes of Valkyries, mentioned only once. And we have this rope of Freya that was possibly made out of the falcon feathers.
Oh, right.
So in general, I found that birds could be some mentioned as a birds per se, like we have Hunin and Munin, or Harbrock, or those birds who sitting on Yggdrasil, so eagle and also hawk. And we have birds who are some transformation of gods, Odin, eagle, giants eagles, and Freya possibly falcon. And we have birds described as a part of the funeral rituals, but those mentioned are not in these Nordic sources, not in the sources from Scandinavia, but from the sources from abroad. So, like Saxo Grammaticus, Ibn Fadlan.
Ah, yes.
And we have some mention from mention of birds in some very puzzling rituals, like sacrificing chickens instead of hawks. So in general,
Yes.
so they are 3-4 categories of the description of the birds per se. So and so it's possible to link meaning of birds and some archaeological material. I mean, so very useful in this context is mention of Ibn Fadlan. When we have those chickens, I mean, firstly, pair of hen and rooster, and later the only hen, who are firstly the only animals who are sacrificed twice during this complex ceremony. And what is interesting, so hen was chosen by angel of death and forwarded to this girl, who after this puzzling ritual with the door frames, so sacrifice this hen and beheaded. So it's interesting. It could be some also used in the interpretation of some archaeological material, because some, as I mentioned, some hens were preserved fragmentary, and maybe they were sacrificed in a similar way. But we also need to be very cautious, because it's a written sources, and it could be some view of person who saw it and not properly maybe describe it with some own view and ideas. So, but there were some, as I mentioned, only few description of those birds, and there are also some mention of geese, but in sagas as a part of the some augury made by woman associated with magic, that she chosen one of the geese at the farm and would like to sacrifice all of them, but it turns out that sacrifice only a few, if I remember, only 2. So but the sagas are problematic, so because they not always describe some reality, so it could be some fantasy. So I'm far away from saying that those what we read in sagas, so that happened directly in the Viking Age.
Yes,
there are some grain of truth in some mentions, but we need to be cautious in analyzing those mentions.
Right. So yeah, go on.
Yeah, so there are only a few mention of those birds. And what is interesting, so I know that maybe some people correct me, but there were not so many mention of the wild birds as wild birds per se in some symbolic ritual contexts in sagas. So but those birds occur in the archaeological context. So just to summarize, so that happened that some bird species are present in the graves, but they are not visualized, and that happened that some birds were described like swans in several written sources, but they were not happen in archaeological context. So that happened.
So in terms of, I have 3 last questions for you. Firstly, what do you think are the broader implications of your study for archaeology of any period, of any place, of any region? Are there any takeaway, lessons that you feel have broader significance for the study of birds in funerary archaeology?
I hope that people who read my study, so they will start to look more into birds in general in their studies, because I know that some people started to go into birds in the Bronze Age, old Iron Age, or even later times, but there are some who not pay some attention. I'm also hoping that some researchers, some people interested in this topic, so start maybe to look into different animal species, not only birds, from the perspective of the human and non-human relation interactions in the past, and they start to observe not only that what happened in the graves or in the farm, but also around, and also some start to maybe seeing some different aspects of this interaction. So I hope that it will be some kind of the inspiration in those analyses of human-animal interactions. So.
And what do you think you will be doing in the future? What are your thoughts of your ongoing or future research ideas? Anything you would be willing to share, or are you still planning the next stage? You don't have to say if you don't want to.
So I am in this stage when I'm considering different possibilities.
Okay.
So I will see what happen in the future. So, but when people are interested in the birds and would like to have maybe some literature advices, or maybe would like to ask me something in more detail to explain it, I'm willing to answer any emails, any questions via social media. So I am still open to discuss those meaning of birds or funeral rituals in the Viking Age, or maybe beyond Viking Age. So I am really willing also to help people who are starting now their BA, MA, and PhD and need some advices on different topics. So yeah. So
that's very kind and generous of you. Do you have a where can folks find out about your research? We're going to put some links in the description, but is your thesis available, or is it still, or are you hoping to publish elements of it in another venue? Well, I know you've already got publications out, but let people know where they can find out about you.
So I have the open for public blog called Viking Age Birds. There's possible to find any information and details about my current work there, also some about my publication and so on. I'm also available in many of social media. And so I'm also reachable by email, so my university email, but I also have this DAD personal email. So and relating to my thesis is available now by request. So if someone is interested and would like to read it, so please write me an email and I will answer. So regarding publication, I will have some publication like a part of a thesis or chapters in the publications related to the topic of thesis. I'm now working with co-editors. So I'm one of the co-editor of a publication after EAA session of the meaning of birds in the past, mostly in Iron Age.
Okay.
So there will be published one chapter which will be devoted to those special graves with unburned remains of chickens. But regarding publication, the whole thesis, I am considering it, but I would like to revise it and take into account some remarks of the committee that I get during my defense. So I suppose it takes time for my thesis to be published. So if you are really interested and really eager to learn more about birds, and you are looking for information, so just write me an email and I will send you a thesis as it is now. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Klaudia, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. And as I said, we'll put descriptions about you and how people can contact you in the description of this video. But I just want to say thank you. It's been a real treat, and good luck with all of your ongoing research endeavours, Klaudia.
Thank you so much. It was really pleasure to talk about meaning of birds. And as I said, so I am open to any questions, any comments. So if you heard or saw something in this video and you have different ideas and you maybe found something which I had no possibility to reach, so just let me know in the comments. So thank you in advance for any remarks, comments, and it was really, really pleasure to talk here. And I hope that it will be some kind of the inspiration for you.
For a